Let me start with something that rarely gets said out loud. People who love too hard too fast are not impulsive romantics chasing fairy tales. They're not careless with their hearts or blind to reality. They are not naive. What they are is deeply conditioned to offer everything immediately because somewhere along the way they learned that love requires total surrender from the very beginning. That holding back feels dangerous. That waiting feels like abandonment. Loving too hard too fast doesn't always look like the dramatic movie version. It doesn't always mean grand gestures or reckless decisions. Sometimes it looks like texting constantly in the first week, saying, "I love you" within days of meeting, planning futures before present moments have fully formed, merging lives so rapidly that friends notice the person seems to have disappeared. It looks like being all in before the other person has even decided if they're interested. It looks like devotion that feels desperate from the inside, even when it appears passionate from the outside. These are often highly self-aware people. They know they do this. They can see the pattern clearly. They understand it intellectually. They've read about attachment styles, analysed their childhoods, talked it through in therapy. And still, when they meet someone new, something inside them activates with urgency they cannot seem to control. The knowledge doesn't stop the pattern. The awareness doesn't prevent the intensity. What makes this pattern so confusing is that it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like necessity. Like if they don't pour everything into this connection immediately, the window will close, the person will lose interest, the opportunity will vanish. So they give everything right away, not because they're reckless, but because withholding feels like a form of slow death. The outside appearance is generous, open, passionate. The person seems emotionally available, willing to be vulnerable, eager to build something real. From the outside, it can look like healthy enthusiasm for a new relationship. From the inside, it feels like terror barely contained. There is constant monitoring of the other person's responses, constant interpretation of tone changes, constant vigilance for signs of cooling interest. The mind never stops calculating. This pattern shows up in romantic relationships, but it doesn't originate there. It begins much earlier, long before the first crush, long before love becomes something they seek. The template forms in childhood, in the earliest experiences of connection and disconnection, presence and absence, safety and threat. And that's exactly where the pattern begins. It usually starts long before the first relationship, long before the first crush, long before love even becomes a concept they understand. The pattern forms quietly in childhood. There is no single moment where someone decides they will love this way. Instead, it develops through hundreds of small interactions that teach a nervous system what love requires. The child learns without words that connection is uncertain, that attention must be earned, that love appears and disappears based on factors they cannot predict or control. Maybe the parent is warm one day, cold the next. Maybe affection comes when the child performs well, withdraws when performance falters. Maybe the parent is physically present but emotionally absent, there but not really there. The child's nervous system begins mapping a territory where safety is conditional. Over time, they learn to read the room before entering it, to gauge mood before speaking, to adjust their own emotional state to match what seems required. This isn't conscious strategy. This is survival. The child who can predict and accommodate has a better chance of maintaining connection. So they become expert accommodators, expert readers, expert performers. What they often don't receive is the experience of being loved simply for existing, not for being helpful, not for being easy, not for managing their needs efficiently, just for being themselves. When that foundational experience is missing, the child internalizes a dangerous belief that love is something to earn through constant effort, that worth must be proven again and again, that relaxing into being loved is not an option available to them. Many people who love too hard too fast grew up as the emotional caretaker in their family, the one who sensed when a parent was struggling and tried to fix it, the one who managed sibling conflicts, the one who became a small adult before they had a chance to be a child. This role felt important. It gave them purpose. It made them indispensable. But it also taught them that their value comes from what they provide, not from who they are. Another layer of this early conditioning comes from inconsistent caregiving. When affection, attention, and approval arrive unpredictably, the child's nervous system learns to stay hyper-alert. Love becomes something to secure through constant vigilance. The child never learns that connection can be steady, that people can be reliably present, that love doesn't require constant effort to maintain. This creates anxious attachment, the belief that abandonment is always possible, that distance means rejection, that any sign of withdrawal signals the end. The child who experiences this doesn't just worry about losing connection. Their entire nervous system organizes around preventing it. This becomes the blueprint for every relationship that follows. The absence of a secure base has lasting effects. When children don't experience at least one relationship where they can return consistently to safety, where emotions are met with stability, where needs don't create problems, they don't internalize the possibility of secure love. Instead, they internalize vigilance. They learn to monitor rather than trust, to control rather than surrender, to pursue rather than receive. Over time, these children learn that expressing needs directly pushes people away, that asking for too much creates distance, that being upset or difficult makes them burdensome, so they learn to minimize their own needs, to become easy, to take up less space, and simultaneously they become hyper-focused on others' needs, trying to make themselves indispensable through service. This is how a child learns that love is something you prove, not something you receive. And this becomes the blueprint for every relationship that follows. By the time they reach adolescence, the pattern is already running beneath conscious awareness. It doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like who they are. The first time they experience romantic attraction, something inside them activates with unusual intensity. What others describe as butterflies feels more like urgency. What others call a crush feels like necessity. Their first relationships become all-consuming immediately, not because the relationship itself is extraordinary, but because their nervous system interprets connection as a survival need. The person they're interested in becomes the center of their world overnight. They think about them constantly, text them endlessly, rearrange their entire schedule to be available. This intensity feels to them like proof of how deeply they care, like evidence of authentic love. What they don't realize is that they're mistaking anxiety for passion. The racing heart isn't excitement, it's activation. The obsessive thoughts aren't romantic devotion. They're the nervous system trying to secure what it believes could disappear at any moment. The urgency to be together constantly isn't intimacy. It's fear of separation masquerading as closeness. The pattern in adolescence typically follows a specific arc. They meet someone, feel immediate deep connection, begin merging their identity with this person within days or weeks. They give away pieces of themselves, molding into whatever shape seems to keep the other person interested. Their friends notice they've disappeared. Their interests shift to match the other person's interests. Their opinions become negotiable. They erase themselves in service of the relationship. This happens so quickly that they don't even notice it occurring. It feels natural. It feels like what love is supposed to be. They tell themselves this is just what happens when you really care about someone. That merging is intimacy. That sacrifice is devotion. That losing yourself is part of loving fully. From the outside, this can look concerning to friends and family. The person seems to have lost themselves. From the inside, it feels like finally being seen, finally mattering to someone, finally having purpose. They're not aware yet that they're repeating a childhood pattern. They just know this relationship feels important in a way nothing else has. Another dimension of the adolescent experiences the terror of being too much. They feel the intensity of their own emotions and worry constantly that they're overwhelming the other person. So they try to contain it. They try to play it cool. But the effort of containment is exhausting. Eventually, the intensity leaks out in constant contact, in needing reassurance, in jealousy that they frame as caring deeply. When relationships end during this phase, and they always do eventually, the loss feels catastrophic. Not just sad, not just disappointing, devastating, like a fundamental part of themselves has been torn away, which makes sense because they did give away fundamental parts of themselves. They merge so completely that when the relationship ends, they don't know who they are anymore. Each breakup reinforces the pattern rather than challenging it. They conclude that they weren't enough, that if they had just tried harder, given more, been better, the person would have stayed. So in the next relationship, they give even more. They try even harder. They hold even tighter. The pattern intensifies with each repetition. Over time, they form a belief that becomes central to their identity. That normal love isn't enough. That to keep someone, they must be extraordinary. Must offer everything. Must make themselves so indispensable that leaving becomes unthinkable. This belief drives them toward intensity and away from the kind of steady, slow-building connection that might actually feel secure. What they don't realize is that the intensity isn't love. It's the nervous system trying to secure what it learned long ago could disappear at any moment. As they move into adult relationships, the pattern becomes more sophisticated. It learns to hide itself. It learns to look like generosity, like devotion, like strength. But underneath, it's still the same desperate calculation. In adulthood, people who love too hard too fast often appear remarkably healthy from the outside. They seem generous, emotionally available, deeply committed. They talk about vulnerability and authenticity. They pride themselves on loving fully. They may even work in helping professions or be known among friends as the person who gives great relationship advice. But when they enter a new relationship, old patterns activate immediately. Within the first date or two, they're already imagining futures, already planning how this person might fit into their life, already feeling a pull toward merger that they recognize but cannot seem to resist. The intensity builds rapidly. They want to see the person constantly. They share deep personal history unusually quickly. They say, "I love you" weeks or even days into knowing someone. From their perspective, this feels like emotional honesty. like being brave enough to show up fully, like not playing games or being strategic. They tell themselves they're just being authentic, just following their heart, just allowing themselves to love without walls. What they don't see is that this isn't walls coming down. This is boundaries dissolving entirely. Another common manifestation is the immediate willingness to cancel their own plans, change their own schedule, rearrange their own life to accommodate the new person. If the person mentions their free Tuesday night, they become free Tuesday night regardless of what they had planned. If the person likes a certain type of food, they suddenly like it too. If the person has a particular political view, or spiritual practice, or favourite band, they become deeply interested in learning about it. This adaptation happens so automatically that they barely notice it. It feels like flexibility, like being easygoing, like showing care through accommodation. What it actually represents is the erasure of self in service of connection. They're becoming what they think the other person wants, rather than revealing who they actually are. The internal monitoring system runs constantly. After every text they send, they watch for the response. They note how long it takes. They interpret the tone. If there's a delay, they spiral into interpretation. Did they say something wrong? Is the person losing interest? Should they text again or wait? The anxiety builds until the response comes, bringing temporary relief until the next interaction begins the cycle again. This monitoring extends to all aspects of the relationship. They track mood shifts. They notice changes in physical affection. They register differences in communication frequency. Their mind is constantly gathering data, looking for patterns, trying to predict if the person is pulling away. This vigilance is exhausting, but it feels necessary. If they can just stay alert enough, adjust quickly enough, they can prevent abandonment. They also take on massive emotional labour in the relationship. They manage not just their own anxiety, but they try to manage the emotional temperature of the entire relationship. If there's conflict, they rush to fix it. If the other person seems upset, they immediately try to make it better. They become hyper-responsive to any sign of distress, often taking responsibility for emotions that aren't theirs to manage. Over time, this creates a pattern where they're giving far more than they actually have to give. They're running an emotional deficit. But stopping feels impossible, because stopping might mean losing the person. So they continue, even as resentment begins building underneath the surface. They notice they're tired. They notice they're doing most of the emotional work. They notice the relationship feels unbalanced, but they can't seem to stop. Many people who love this way mistake enmeshment for intimacy. They believe that healthy love means thinking about the person constantly, wanting to be together all the time, sharing everything immediately. They don't recognize that real intimacy requires separateness. That two whole people choosing connection is fundamentally different from two people merging into one. The loss of self happens gradually. First preferences become negotiable. What movie to watch, where to eat, how to spend weekends. Then opinions shift. They find themselves agreeing with things they're not sure they actually believe. Then values start bending. Things that once mattered deeply become less important if they create friction. Eventually, they look in the mirror and don't fully recognize who they've become. Another aspect of the adult manifestation is the performance of being the perfect partner. They work hard to anticipate needs before they're expressed, to be supportive, understanding, patient, fun, attractive, interesting. They curate themselves, showing the parts they believe will be valued. Hiding the parts they fear might create distance. This performance is exhausting because it requires constant self-monitoring and adjustment. The strategy underlying all of this is making themselves indispensable. If they can become essential to the other person's happiness, essential to their daily life, essential to their emotional regulation, then leaving becomes much harder. So they offer themselves as the solution to every problem. They become the person the other calls first, relies on most, cannot imagine life without. This feels like love. It's actually a prevention strategy. What they don't see is that this level of intensity and merger often drives people away rather than securing them. Partners begin to feel suffocated. They feel the weight of being someone's entire world. They feel guilty for needing space because they know space will cause the person pain. The relationship becomes about managing one person's anxiety rather than mutual growth and discovery. The exhaustion of maintaining this intensity eventually shows. They're tired but can't admit it because admitting exhaustion might look like they don't care enough. They're resentful but can't express it because expressing resentment might create conflict. So they push down their own truth and keep performing, keep giving, keep disappearing. This kind of love doesn't feel optional. It feels like survival. And that's because neurologically it is. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between romantic rejection and survival threat. For people who love too hard too fast, separation activates the same ancient panic as abandonment once did. What feels like love is often the nervous system in a state of activation. The intensity, the urgency, the all-consuming focus. These are not signs of deep connection. They are signs of dysregulation. When someone with anxious attachment meets a new person they're attracted to, their nervous system responds as if they've found a potential source of regulation. The other person becomes, unconsciously, the solution to their internal dysregulation. Being near this person brings temporary calm. Being separated from them triggers activation. This isn't about the person themselves. It's about what the nervous system believes this person represents. In the early stages of connection, the brain floods with dopamine and oxytocin. These neurochemicals create feelings of euphoria, bonding, obsessive focus. For everyone, new romantic connection activates these systems. But for people with anxious attachment, the response is often more intense. Their baseline nervous system state is already somewhat activated, already scanning for threat. When connection appears, the relief is profound. The neurochemical surge is stronger. The attachment forms more rapidly. Another neurobiological factor is how uncertainty affects dopamine. When rewards are unpredictable, dopamine release actually increases. This is called intermittent reinforcement, and it's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. In relationships, when someone is sometimes responsive and sometimes distant, the uncertainty creates stronger dopamine responses than consistent availability would. This means that people who love too hard too fast are often unconsciously drawn to partners who are inconsistent, because inconsistency activates their system more intensely. The body also responds to perceived threats of abandonment with cortisol release. When the person they're attached to doesn't respond to a text quickly, when they sense emotional distance, when conflict arises, their body floods with stress hormones. This creates the physical sensation of danger. Heart races, stomach tightens, breathing becomes shallow. This isn't dramatic emotional overreaction. This is physiological response to what the nervous system interprets as threat. This is why they can't just calm down, why logic doesn't work, why knowing better doesn't prevent the pattern. The response is subcortical. It's happening in brain regions that developed early in evolution, regions that don't respond to rational thought. The thinking brain can understand that a delayed text doesn't mean abandonment. But the survival brain doesn't care about understanding. It responds to what it perceives as danger. For people who learned in childhood that connection is uncertain, the nervous system remains hypervigilant even in calm moments. It constantly scans for signs of threat. A shift in tone during conversation, a decrease in communication frequency, a moment of distraction when they're together. These tiny signals get interpreted as danger because the nervous system is calibrated to expect loss. The hypervigilance shows up as constant awareness of the other person's emotional state. They can sense mood shifts immediately. They notice micro-expressions. They track patterns in communication. This sensitivity developed as survival skill in childhood. When you grow up needing to predict a caregiver's mood to stay safe, you become expert at reading subtle cues. In adult relationships, this translates to exhausting emotional monitoring. Another aspect is how the pattern creates addiction to intensity. When the nervous system is chronically activated, intensity becomes the baseline. Calm feels wrong, steady feels boring, drama feels like engagement, so they unconsciously seek relationships that maintain high activation, not because they enjoy chaos, but because their nervous system is calibrated to it. Calm relationships can actually feel threatening because the nervous system doesn't know how to interpret safety. This is why secure relationships can initially feel flat or uninteresting to people who love too hard too fast. The lack of intensity doesn't register as peaceful, it registers as absence. The person seems nice, but doesn't create the same neurochemical surge. There's no obsessive thinking, no desperate need to be together constantly. And because intensity has become associated with love, the absence of intensity feels like the absence of connection. The relief of merger, of being together constantly, of knowing where the person is and what they're feeling, provides temporary nervous system regulation. It's not actually solving the dysregulation, it's using another person as external regulation strategy. When proximity provides calm, separation triggers panic. This creates a cycle where they need the relationship to feel okay, which means the relationship becomes less about connection and more about nervous system management. Why distance feels physically painful makes sense in this context. When attachment forms rapidly and intensely, the brain begins treating the other person as part of the self. Separation from them activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The ache isn't metaphorical, it's neurological. The brain is responding to separation as if part of the body has been removed. Over time, the nervous system becomes dependent on the pattern. Intensity becomes the marker of love. Anxiety becomes confused with passion. The physiological activation that should signal danger becomes associated with romance. This is why people who love too hard too fast often describe feeling most alive in the early intense phase of relationships. Their nervous system is fully activated, flooding them with neurochemicals, and they interpret this as evidence of profound connection. The pattern isn't a character flaw, it's a nervous system adaptation. And understanding this changes everything about how to approach it. But knowing the neurobiology doesn't make the pattern less painful. It doesn't stop the cycle from repeating. Because the pattern has other dimensions that neuroscience alone cannot address. People who love too hard too fast often describe a strange experience. They meet someone, feel intense connection, and within weeks find themselves unable to remember who they were before. Their preferences become uncertain, their desires become unclear, their identity becomes negotiable. The rapid merger of identity with a new partner happens automatically. They begin adopting the other person's worldview without conscious decision. If the person is interested in hiking, they become interested in hiking. If the person follows certain politics, they shift their views in that direction. If the person has a particular friend group or social scene, they integrate themselves completely. This isn't strategic, it's unconscious adaptation. Over time, boundaries between self and other blur entirely. They stop knowing what they actually want versus what they think the other person wants. When asked to choose something simple, like what to order at a restaurant, they defer. Not because they don't have preferences, but because accessing those preferences requires an internal reference point that has dissolved. They've become so oriented toward the other person that their own internal compass stops functioning clearly. This identity fusion feels, at first, like beautiful intimacy, like two people becoming one, like the romantic ideal of union. They describe feeling complete when with this person, like they've found their missing piece. What they don't recognize is that they're not finding themselves in this connection, they're losing themselves. The loss follows a pattern. First, small preferences disappear. Music taste, food choices, how to spend free time. These feel minor, so they hardly notice. Then opinions begin shifting. Views on topics they once felt strongly about become flexible. They tell themselves they're learning, growing, becoming more open-minded. Sometimes this is true, often it's erosion. Next, values start bending. Things that mattered deeply, principles they thought were core to who they are, become negotiable if they create friction in the relationship. Maybe they valued independence but find themselves giving it up. Maybe they valued certain lifestyle choices but find themselves compromising. Maybe they valued specific relationship dynamics but find themselves accepting different ones. Each compromise feels reasonable in isolation. Collectively, they represent fundamental self-abandonment. The person they become in relationship is often unrecognizable to people who knew them before. Friends comment that they've changed. Family notices they seem different. But the person themselves often can't see it. From inside the merger, it feels like they're just being flexible, just adapting, just showing love through accommodation. They don't realize they've disappeared. Another aspect of identity fusion is the loss of separate social world. Their friends become primarily the partner's friends. Their activities become the activities the partner enjoys. Their time becomes organized entirely around the partner's schedule and preferences. They tell themselves this is normal, that this is what committed relationships look like. They don't recognize that healthy relationships include separateness, include maintaining connections and interest outside the partnership. What they call flexibility is actually self-erasure. What they call accommodation is actually self-abandonment. What they call love is actually the dissolution of boundaries that healthy relationships require. But they can't see this while it's happening because the pattern feels so familiar. It feels like what they've always done. It feels like how they know to be in relationship. The exhaustion of constant self-monitoring and adjustment builds slowly. They're not just existing in the relationship, they're constantly calculating. constantly adjusting their presentation based on what seems to work, constantly suppressing reactions that might create distance, constantly performing a version of themselves designed to maintain connection. This performance requires enormous energy. Resentment begins accumulating underneath the surface. They notice they're doing all the adjusting. They notice the relationship feels one-sided. They notice they can't remember the last time they stated a preference or said no to something. But expressing this resentment feels dangerous. It might create conflict. It might make them seem difficult. So they push it down and continue the performance. Over time, they become disconnected from their own inner world. They know what they should feel. They remember what they used to feel. But accessing current authentic feeling becomes difficult. It's like trying to recall a song that's just out of reach. They can describe emotions intellectually. They can analyze their psychological state. But they can't quite feel it directly anymore. This creates strange internal emptiness. They're highly attuned to the other person's emotional state but alienated from their own. They can read the partner's needs clearly but can't identify their own. They become expert at understanding what's happening for others while losing touch with what's happening inside themselves. The cruel paradox is that they lose themselves trying to become lovable, but what they offer isn't authentic self. It's a carefully constructed performance designed to prevent abandonment. This performance requires constant vigilance, constant monitoring, constant adjustment. And this is where another dimension of the pattern emerges. People who love too hard too fast live in a state of constant interpretation. Every text is analysed, every tone shift is noted, every silence is measured, every expression is read for hidden meaning. The mental exhaustion of constant monitoring is profound. They're not present in conversations because they're simultaneously participating and analysing. They're noting word choices, they're tracking changes in enthusiasm, they're measuring response times, they're looking for patterns that might indicate shifting feelings. The mind never rests because resting means missing signals that the nervous system believes are critical to survival. They read micro-expressions constantly. A slight change in facial expression during conversation gets interpreted. Was that disappointment? Annoyance? Boredom? The partner sighs and they immediately scan for meaning. The partner's tone shifts slightly and they catalogue it. The partner seems distracted and they start calculating what it might mean. Every tiny piece of data gets gathered and analysed. This creates narratives from minimal information. If a text response takes 10 minutes instead of 5, they construct entire stories. Maybe the person is losing interest. Maybe they're talking to someone else. Maybe they're annoyed about something from earlier. The anxiety spiral begins with almost nothing and builds into full panic based on interpretation, not evidence. The cycle runs constantly. Notice change, interpret as rejection, feel panic, adjust behavior to compensate, experience temporary relief when response comes, then start watching for the next change. There is no rest in this cycle, no peace. Even moments of connection are shadowed by vigilance for signs that connection might be fading. Another exhausting aspect is thinking 3 steps ahead constantly. They're not experiencing the present moment. They're anticipating future scenarios. If they say this, the partner might respond that way. If the partner responds that way, they'll need to adjust. If things feel distant, they'll need a plan to reconnect. The mind is always calculating, always strategizing, always trying to stay ahead of potential problems. This prevents genuine presence. When together, they're not fully there. Part of their awareness is monitoring, assessing, adjusting. They're watching the partner's reactions to everything they say or do. They're gauging if the partner seems happy, engaged, attracted. They're performing and simultaneously evaluating the performance. This makes authentic spontaneity nearly impossible. The interpretation bias runs heavily negative. Ambiguous signals get read as threatening. If the partner is quiet, it means something's wrong. If the partner seems tired, it means they're losing interest. If the partner needs space, it means rejection is coming. Neutral is rarely interpreted as neutral. The nervous system is calibrated to expect loss, so it finds evidence of coming loss everywhere. They seek reassurance constantly but cannot believe it when it comes. They might ask if everything is okay. The partner says yes. They feel better for maybe an hour. Then doubt creeps back in. Maybe the partner was just being nice. Maybe the partner doesn't want to start a difficult conversation. Maybe everything is not actually okay. So they seek reassurance again, creating a pattern that exhausts both people. Another dimension is how they exhaust partners with the need for constant emotional updates. They need to know what the partner is feeling, thinking, planning. They need confirmation of connection. They need evidence that nothing has changed. This need is relentless because the anxiety is relentless. No amount of reassurance satisfies it for long because the anxiety isn't about the partner's actual feelings. It's about the nervous system's expectation of loss. From the outside, they often appear calm. They've learned to hide the internal chaos. They smile. They seem relaxed. They act casual. But inside, they are calculating constantly, reading everything, interpreting everything, adjusting everything. The performance of ease while experiencing internal panic takes enormous energy. The mind never rests. This level of vigilance isn't sustainable. The nervous system cannot remain in threat detection mode indefinitely. Eventually, something has to give. What often gives is the relationship itself. Not because love isn't there, but because the pattern makes genuine connection impossible. The pattern creates a painful paradox. People who love too hard too fast often experience repeated relationship failures despite giving everything. They love deeply, commit fully, try harder than anyone else, and yet relationships still end. The intensity they offer, the intensity that feels like proof of their devotion, is often exactly what drives people away. Partners begin to feel suffocated. They feel watched, monitored, analysed. They feel responsible for another person's entire emotional state. They feel like they can't have a bad day, can't be tired, can't need space without causing a crisis. The relationship stops being about mutual discovery and becomes about managing one person's anxiety. What the person who loves too hard experiences as care, partners often experience as pressure. The constant texting feels like monitoring. The immediate availability feels like lack of boundaries. The rapid intensity feels like too much too fast. The willingness to merge completely feels overwhelming rather than romantic. Partners feel like they're being asked to be someone's everything, and that responsibility feels heavy. Another reason relationships fail despite the intensity is that too much love creates obligation rather than desire. When someone gives excessively, it creates unconscious debt. The partner feels they should reciprocate, should match the intensity, should be grateful, but obligation kills attraction. Desire requires freedom. When someone feels obligated to love someone back, genuine feeling gets buried under pressure. The relationship also becomes unbalanced in ways that breed resentment on both sides. The person who loves too hard resents doing all the emotional work, making all the adjustments, caring more. The partner resents the pressure, the monitoring, the intensity, the guilt they feel when they can't match it. Both people end up unhappy but trapped in a dynamic neither quite knows how to change. Over time, partners need breathing room. They need space to exist separately. They need to reconnect with their own life outside the relationship. When they express this need, it gets interpreted as rejection. The person who loves too hard panics. They hear, "I need space and understand I'm leaving." So instead of respecting the boundary, they pursue harder. They try to fix whatever they believe is wrong. They offer more attention, more support, more everything. This makes the partner need even more space. The cycle accelerates. The pattern often follows a predictable arc. Intense beginning where partner is swept up in the passion. Gradual realization that the intensity is unsustainable. Partner expresses need for more balance. Person who loves too hard interprets this as rejection and intensifies efforts. Partner feels increasingly suffocated. Partner begins withdrawing. Person who loves too hard becomes desperate. Partner ends relationship. Person who loves too hard is devastated and confused because they gave everything. This happens across multiple relationships, different people, same pattern. Each time they conclude the problem was them not being enough. Not that the pattern itself is the problem, but that they didn't execute it well enough. So they commit to giving even more next time, being even more available, trying even harder. The pattern strengthens with each repetition instead of loosening. Another painful aspect is the feedback they receive when relationships end. Partners say things like, "You're amazing, but it's too intense," or "I feel like I'm drowning," or "I need someone who has their own life." This feedback is confusing because they were trying to show love, trying to be devoted, trying to prove they cared. How can caring too much be the problem? They don't understand that the issue isn't the amount of love. The issue is that what they're calling love is actually anxiety, desperation, and enmeshment. Real love allows the other person space to be separate. Real love trusts. Real love doesn't require constant proof and reassurance. But they've never experienced this kind of love, so they don't recognize that what they're offering isn't it. The pattern of being too much gets confirmed again and again. Person after person tells them some version of the same thing. They're too intense, too available, too focused on the relationship. Each confirmation deepens the core wound that they're inherently unlovable. They conclude that something is fundamentally wrong with them, not that they learned a dysfunctional pattern that can be unlearned. When relationships end, self-blame is immediate and total. They replay every interaction. They identify everything they did wrong. They catalogue all their failures. If only they had been less needy, less anxious, less available, less themselves. The self-criticism is brutal and unrelenting. What they rarely consider is that the pattern itself, not their execution of it, is what needs to change. The pattern doesn't fail because they love wrong. It fails because they learned that love requires total surrender. And total surrender leaves no room for two separate people to exist. After enough relationships end this way, something inside starts to change. Not healing, not yet. But a different kind of exhaustion begins to settle in. There comes a point, after several relationships follow the same pattern, where people who love too hard too fast begin to shut down. Not consciously, Not all at once. But slowly, the part of them that reaches out so desperately starts to go quiet. Emotional exhaustion from repeated cycles becomes overwhelming. Each relationship takes enormous energy. The intensity, the monitoring, the adjustment, the eventual loss. Recovering from one relationship barely finishes before they're pulled into the next. Eventually, the nervous system cannot sustain the pattern anymore. It needs rest. So withdrawal begins. The withdrawal from dating and relationships happens gradually. At first, they tell themselves they're just taking a break, just focusing on themselves for a while. But the break extends, months pass, then years. They're not actively avoiding relationship. They're just not pursuing it. The thought of entering another intense connection feels exhausting rather than exciting. This withdrawal isn't because they don't want love. They still long for connection desperately. But they're terrified of repeating the pattern, terrified of losing themselves again, terrified of the inevitable moment when they become too much and the person leaves. The fear of repetition becomes stronger than the desire for connection. So they stay isolated, telling themselves it's temporary, it's healing, it's necessary. What develops during this phase is a kind of numbness. Not the acute pain of fresh heartbreak, but a dull, protective distance from feeling altogether. They describe it as flatness, as going through motions, as being fine but not really alive. This numbness is the nervous system trying to protect them from more pain by turning down the volume on all emotion. Cynicism about relationships develops even as longing for connection remains. They watch friends fall in love and feel a mixture of hope and skepticism. Part of them wants to believe it's possible. Part of them is convinced it will end badly. They become the friend who gives cautious relationship advice, who warns about red flags, who emphasizes independence and self-protection. Not because they don't believe in love, but because they believe love always leads to loss. There is grief during this phase for the version of themselves who could still hope, who could still approach connection with openness, who could still believe that this time might be different. That version of themselves feels distant, naive, lost. They miss the capacity for enthusiasm even as they understand why it disappeared. The grief is quiet because it doesn't come from one specific event. It comes from accumulation. Another aspect of withdrawal is self-protection through avoidance. They don't put themselves in situations where connection might develop. They don't pursue friendships that feel too intimate. They don't engage with people who express interest. They create safe distance from anything that might activate the pattern. This feels like wisdom, like healthy boundary setting. Often it's just fear. The loneliness of isolation coupled with fear of connection creates painful internal conflict. They ache to be known, to be close, to matter to someone. But they also cannot imagine risking the pattern again. So they exist in strange middle space, lonely but too frightened to reach out, longing but too exhausted to pursue. This conflict wears on them constantly. Shame spirals develop during this phase. They begin believing they're too broken for relationship, too damaged, too much work. They look at their relationship history and see only failure. They conclude that something fundamental about them makes them incapable of healthy love. This shame keeps them isolated more effectively than conscious choice could. Another shift during withdrawal is how they intellectualize rather than feel. They can explain their patterns in detail. They understand attachment theory. They know their childhood wounds. They can analyze every relationship and identify exactly what went wrong. This intellectual understanding feels like progress. Sometimes it is. Often it's another form of distance from actual feeling. They become disconnected from their own desire. If asked what they want in relationship, they struggle to answer. Not because they don't know intellectually, but because they've lost connection to the felt sense of wanting. Desire requires vulnerability. Vulnerability feels dangerous, so desire gets buried underneath analysis and self-protection. Watching others in relationships brings complicated emotions. Part of them genuinely happy for friends who find love, part of them envious, part of them waiting for it to fall apart because that's what always happens. They try to be supportive but can't fully trust that any relationship will last. This isn't cynicism for its own sake, it's protection against hope that has disappointed them too many times. The loneliness becomes familiar. This withdrawal is not healing, it's another form of the same wound. The pattern has just inverted from desperate pursuit to desperate avoidance. But withdrawal also creates something unexpected. In the stillness, in the absence of relationship intensity, there is finally space for a different kind of awareness to emerge. Recognition doesn't arrive as a sudden insight. It arrives quietly, usually during a moment of stillness. Maybe while watching a friend in a healthy relationship. Maybe while remembering a conversation from childhood. Maybe while sitting alone and finally feeling safe enough to acknowledge what has always been true. The difference between knowing about the pattern and truly seeing it is profound. They've known intellectually for years. They could explain anxious attachment. They could describe their childhood wounds. They could predict how their relationships would unfold. But knowing and seeing are different. Seeing means feeling the truth in the body, not just understanding it in the mind. Recognition often comes with grief. Grief for time lost to the pattern. Grief for relationships that might have worked if they'd known better. Grief for all the versions of themselves they abandoned in pursuit of connection. This grief is important. It marks the moment where the pattern becomes visible as pattern rather than simply who they are. Another aspect of recognition is understanding that the intensity was never really about the other person. The desperate need to merge, the constant monitoring, the rapid attachment. None of it was about the specific human they were directing it toward. It was about a wound seeking healing, about a nervous system seeking regulation, about a child inside still trying to secure the love that felt uncertain. This realization can be devastating. It means that what they called their deepest loves might have been their deepest projections, that they were trying to get childhood needs met through adult relationships, that the people they loved so intensely were, in some ways, objects in their unconscious healing attempt rather than separate humans they were truly seeing. They begin recognizing how the pattern served them once but now only hurts. As children, becoming hypervigilant, learning to accommodate, taking on emotional caretaking. These were brilliant adaptations to difficult circumstances. These strategies helped them survive environments where love was conditional. But survival strategies from childhood rarely translate well to adult relationships. What saved them then is sabotaging them now. Recognition also brings compassion, slowly. When they truly see how young they were when the pattern formed, when they understand they were doing the best they could with what they knew, some of the harsh self-judgment begins to soften. They start seeing the child who learned these patterns with tenderness rather than contempt. This child was trying to be loved, was trying to be safe, was trying to matter. The strategies made sense in context. Understanding that change is possible but will require letting go of familiar patterns is terrifying. The pattern is known. Even though it causes pain, it's predictable pain. Change means stepping into unknown territory. It means tolerating discomfort of not pursuing when every instinct says pursue. Not merging when merging feels like survival. Not monitoring when monitoring feels like protection. The fear of change can be stronger than the pain of staying the same. Another important dimension of recognition is understanding that healing means tolerating discomfort. Not the dramatic discomfort of heartbreak, but the subtle discomfort of doing things differently. Of sitting with anxiety without immediately reaching for reassurance. Of maintaining boundaries even when boundaries feel selfish. Of existing as separate self even when merger feels safer. This kind of discomfort is unfamiliar and harder to bear than the familiar pain of the pattern. Recognition also brings loneliness of awareness. Most people don't understand this pattern from the inside. Friends mean well, but their advice often misses the point. They suggest just being yourself, just taking it slow, just not overthinking, as if the pattern is a choice rather than a deep conditioning. The person who's gained recognition often feels isolated in their understanding, unable to fully explain to others what they're working with. The beginning of grieving what was never received in childhood is another aspect of recognition. They start to feel, really feel, the absence of secure attachment, the absence of being loved unconditionally, the absence of safe base to return to. This grief can feel bottomless because it's not grief for something lost. It's grief for something that never existed. You can't remember what you never had, but you can feel the absence. Recognition is not a solution. It is an opening into a different relationship with the pattern, with the past, and eventually with the possibility of change. But recognition alone is not enough. Understanding why the pattern exists doesn't automatically dissolve it. The nervous system doesn't release its strategies just because the mind sees them clearly. The nervous system doesn't just need understanding, it needs safety. For people who love too hard too fast, safety has been missing for a long time. Not physical safety, but relational safety. The kind that allows someone to be imperfect without abandonment. The kind that allows needs without shame. The kind that allows separateness without loss. Why insight doesn't automatically change behavior is neurological. The pattern lives in the body, in the nervous system, in subcortical brain regions that don't respond to intellectual understanding. These parts of the brain learn through experience, not through thinking. You can know that your partner's need for space doesn't mean rejection. Your thinking brain can hold this truth clearly. But when they say they need time alone, the survival brain still floods with panic. Understanding doesn't stop the flood. The nervous system is operating from survival strategies learned in childhood, when the brain was developing, when experiences were literally wiring neural pathways. These pathways become deeply established. They're not personality flaws or bad habits. They're physical structures in the brain and nervous system, patterns of activation that have been reinforced thousands of times. Changing them requires new experiences that create new pathways, not just new thoughts. Another reason the pattern persists despite awareness is that it feels safe because it's familiar. The nervous system doesn't seek what's healthy, it seeks what's known. The pattern of intensity, monitoring, merger. This is familiar territory. Even though it causes pain, it's predictable pain. The nervous system knows how to operate in this territory. Secure relationship, calm connection, steady affection. These are unfamiliar. Unfamiliar feels threatening even when it's actually safer. The terror of changing is profound. Slowing down when meeting someone new feels like abandonment is inevitable. Not merging feels like being alone. Maintaining boundaries feels like being cold and unloving. These aren't just thoughts. They're felt truths in the body. The nervous system is screaming that changing the pattern will lead to loss. Even when the mind knows better, the body believes what it learned. How secure attachment must be learned through experience, not knowledge, is crucial to understand. Reading about secure attachment doesn't create it. Understanding attachment theory doesn't rewire the nervous system. What creates change is repeated experiences of something different. Experiences where needs are met consistently, where boundaries are respected, where separateness doesn't lead to abandonment. The nervous system learns slowly through repetition, through lived proof that something different is possible. This requires relationships that don't demand the old pattern. Relationships where the person can show up imperfectly and still be met with care, where they can express needs without creating problems, where they can be separate without losing connection. For many people, therapy becomes one such relationship, a place where they can practice new patterns with someone who won't abandon them for being messy or needy or scared. Another important aspect is learning to tolerate the discomfort of not merging, not pursuing, not performing. This discomfort is intense at first. Every instinct says to text constantly, to check in repeatedly, to make sure everything is okay. Resisting these urges feels like resisting survival impulses. The anxiety builds. The nervous system insists that not acting on the impulse will lead to disaster. Learning to sit with this anxiety without immediately relieving it is difficult work. The gradual process of building tolerance for uncertainty is key. People who love too hard, too fast have very low tolerance for uncertainty. Not knowing exactly how someone feels, exactly where they stand, exactly what will happen. This uncertainty triggers panic. Healing involves slowly increasing capacity to tolerate not knowing, to sit with questions instead of immediately demanding answers, to allow space instead of immediately filling it. This capacity builds incrementally, not all at once. Healing also isn't linear. There will be periods of progress followed by complete regression. Stress, loss, change, new relationships. Any of these can trigger the old pattern to resurface fully. Someone can spend months or years working on the pattern and then meet someone new and find themselves right back in the intensity. This isn't failure. This is how nervous system healing works. The old pathways don't disappear. They just become less dominant. Under stress, they can activate fully again. Understanding that pattern will re-emerge and that this is normal, expected, part of the process is important. It prevents the shame spiral that makes everything worse. When they fall back into old patterns and respond with brutal self-criticism, they're adding another layer of dysregulation on top of the pattern. When they can recognize the pattern emerging and respond with compassion, "Oh, this is the old pattern, I see it," they create space for choice. The nervous system cannot be rushed. It cannot be convinced. It can only be slowly, patiently shown that something different is possible. This showing happens not through dramatic change, but through small, repeated experiences that challenge the original conditioning. Unlearning how to love too hard too fast is not about becoming less loving. It is about learning that love can exist without urgency, without merger, without performance. That connection can survive separateness. That another person's emotions are not your responsibility to manage. Learning to notice the pattern as it's happening rather than only recognizing it after is the first crucial shift. In the moment, when meeting someone new and feeling that familiar pull toward intensity, can they notice it? Can they name it internally? This is the pattern. This is my nervous system responding to potential connection with urgency. The noticing doesn't stop the urge, but it creates a gap between urge and action. Practicing slowing down even when everything inside says speed up is concrete, difficult work. When they want to text immediately, can they wait an hour? When they want to see the person every day, can they maintain other commitments? When they want to share everything immediately, can they hold some things back? Each time they practice slowing down, they're building a new pathway. Teaching the nervous system that slowing down doesn't lead to loss. Tolerating the discomfort of not pursuing when anxious is another essential practice. The anxiety will come when the person doesn't respond quickly, when plans change, when anything creates uncertainty. The old pattern says pursue, check in, seek reassurance. Unlearning means sitting with the anxiety instead, allowing it to be there without immediately acting to relieve it. This is excruciating at first. The discomfort feels intolerable. But tolerance builds with practice. Building capacity to sit with uncertainty without immediately seeking reassurance requires developing other regulation strategies. If the person can't use the partner to regulate, what else can work? Maybe physical movement, maybe calling a friend, maybe breathing practices, maybe creative expression. Learning to regulate internally and through other sources besides the romantic relationship is fundamental to breaking the pattern. Another aspect is learning that needs can be expressed without apology. People who love too hard too fast often apologize for having needs. Sorry to bother you, but I know you're busy, but the apologizing reinforces the belief that needs are burdensome. Unlearning means practicing direct expression. I need reassurance right now. I'm feeling anxious and would like to talk. No apology, just clear communication. This feels terrifying and selfish at first. Discovering that conflict doesn't mean abandonment happens through experience, not belief. The first time they express disagreement and the person doesn't leave. The first time they say no and the person respects it. The first time they set a boundary and connection remains intact. Each experience provides evidence that challenges the old belief. The nervous system begins, slowly, to understand that conflict can be survived. Practicing maintaining self while in relationship is ongoing work. Keeping their own friendships, maintaining their own interests, honouring their own preferences. Each time they choose themselves without losing connection, they're proving to the nervous system that separateness is safe, that they don't have to disappear to be loved. This practice must be repeated countless times before it becomes natural. The terror and freedom of keeping boundaries emerges as the pattern loosens. Boundaries have always felt selfish, cold, unloving. Learning that boundaries are actually what makes intimacy possible, that they protect relationship rather than harm it, requires relearning what love means. The first few times they hold a boundary, they're flooded with guilt. But if the person respects the boundary and connection remains, the guilt begins to ease. How this feels wrong, selfish, cold at first cannot be overstated. Every cell in their body says that what they're doing is wrong, that they're being withholding, that they're not loving enough, that they're going to lose the person. The discomfort is intense and constant. Only through repeatedly doing the thing that feels wrong and discovering it doesn't lead to disaster can the nervous system begin to recalibrate. The gradual building of new neural pathways through repetition is literal neuroscience. Each time they choose differently, they're activating different neurons. The more those neurons fire together, the stronger the pathway becomes. Eventually, the new pathway can become as strong or stronger than the old one. But this takes time and countless repetitions. There is no shortcut, only practice. Learning to regulate without another person is perhaps the most important shift. When their emotional state depends entirely on the other person's presence, availability and mood, they're trapped in external regulation. When they can find calm, safety and okayness through internal resources or other sources besides the romantic partner, they become free. This doesn't mean not needing the partner. It means not being controlled by the need. The grief of letting go of intensity as identity is real. For many people who love too hard too fast, the intensity is how they know they're alive, how they know they care, how they prove their love. Letting it go feels like becoming someone boring, someone who doesn't feel deeply, someone who doesn't love fully. Learning that they can love deeply without intensity, that steadiness is not the same as superficiality, requires mourning the loss of intensity as identity. Unlearning is not about becoming someone new. It is about recovering who they were before the pattern took hold, before they learned that love required disappearing. But recovery is not a solo process. It requires relationship. Not romantic relationship necessarily, but connection that doesn't demand the pattern. People who love too hard too fast cannot heal in isolation. They learn their patterns in relationship, and they must unlearn them in relationship. But not the kind of relationship that activates the old wounds, the kind that offers something they've rarely experienced: consistency without performance. The therapeutic relationship as practice ground for new patterns is invaluable. Therapy provides a relationship where the old strategies don't work and aren't needed. They can't make the therapist love them by being helpful. They can't secure the relationship through performance. They can't control the therapist's feelings. The structure itself challenges the pattern. And within that structure, they can practice showing up as they actually are, messy and uncertain and scared, and discover that this doesn't lead to abandonment. Friendships that don't require emotional caretaking offer another form of healing relationship. Friendships where they don't have to be the listener, the helper, the fixer. Where they can receive support without having to earn it first. Where they can be having a hard time without simultaneously taking care of the other person's response to their hard time. These friendships teach them that they can be cared for without performing. Learning to receive support without having to earn it is profoundly uncomfortable for people who learned that love is transactional. When someone offers care freely, the impulse is to immediately reciprocate, to prove they deserve it, to give something back so they're not in debt. Learning to simply receive, to say thank you, and allow themselves to be supported, to trust that the care isn't conditional, challenges deep beliefs about their worth. Communities where vulnerability doesn't lead to abandonment provide repeated evidence that it's safe to be seen. Maybe a support group where everyone is working with similar patterns. Maybe a community centered around shared interest where they can show up as themselves. Maybe a spiritual community that emphasizes acceptance. Each time they're vulnerable and the response is compassion rather than rejection, the nervous system gathers evidence that vulnerability is survivable, how they need relationships where they can be messy, inconsistent, imperfect matters deeply. The performance of being easy, stable, together. This performance has exhausted them. They need relationships where they can fall apart, where they can be confused, where they can change their mind, where they cannot know. And none of this creates problems. These relationships teach that they don't have to be perfect to be worthy of connection. The terror of being truly seen without performance is the core vulnerability. They've spent so long curating themselves, showing only the parts that seem acceptable, hiding anything that might create distance. Allowing someone to see them completely, see their anxiety and their need and their messiness and their wounds, feels like certain rejection. But when they risk being seen and the person stays, something fundamental shifts. Learning that people can stay even when they're not helpful, not giving, not perfect challenges the transactional model of relationship they internalized. They learned that their worth came from what they provided. When someone stays even when they have nothing to offer, even when they're the one needing support, even when they're difficult or unavailable or struggling, it provides evidence that maybe their worth isn't conditional after all. This slow accumulation of counter-evidence to old beliefs is how healing happens. Not one big transformative experience, but hundreds of small experiences that contradict what they learned. Each time someone respects a boundary. Each time conflict doesn't end connection. Each time they express need and it's met with care rather than annoyance. Each small experience adds to the growing pile of evidence that maybe the old beliefs aren't universal truth. How they learn through repeated experience, not concepts, bears repeating. The mind can understand something long before the nervous system believes it. They can intellectually know that secure love exists, but the nervous system only believes through experience. This is why healing takes time. The nervous system learns slowly, through repetition, through consistency, through proof. The difficulty of trusting that care is genuine when it doesn't require anything is profound. They're so used to conditional care that unconditional care feels suspicious, like there must be a hidden expectation, like eventually the bill will come due. Learning to trust that someone cares simply because they care, not because of what they're getting in return, requires allowing themselves to be cared for over and over until the nervous system starts to believe it's real. These relationships don't fix the pattern. They offer something more valuable. They offer proof that the old beliefs about love might not be universal truth. As new experiences accumulate, something subtle begins to shift. Not the disappearance of the pattern, but a different relationship to it. There is a difficult truth that rarely gets acknowledged in conversations about healing. The pattern of loving too hard, too fast doesn't vanish. The neural pathways formed in childhood, the nervous system responses conditioned over years, these don't simply dissolve because understanding arrives. The pattern remains as default under stress. When life becomes uncertain, when they're going through change, when they're feeling vulnerable, the old pattern will resurface. They'll meet someone new and feel that familiar pull toward intensity. They'll start monitoring texts again. They'll want to merge. The urge will be as strong as it ever was. This doesn't mean healing hasn't happened. It means the pattern is still there, just not running unconsciously all the time. Learning to recognize it earlier in the activation cycle is the shift that matters. Before, the pattern would run completely, before they even noticed it was happening. They'd be weeks into intensity before recognizing they'd done it again. Now they might notice on the first date, might catch themselves composing the third text in a row and pause, might feel the urge to cancel their own plans and recognize what's happening. The pattern activates, but they see it activating. The difference between pattern running unconsciously versus noticing it is everything. Unconscious pattern means being driven by urges without awareness. Conscious pattern means feeling the urges but having choice about whether to act on them. The urges don't disappear, the urgency still arises, but there's a gap now between feeling and action, and in that gap, choice becomes possible. How awareness creates space for choice is subtle but profound. They feel the anxiety when someone doesn't text back immediately. Before, they would have sent another text, maybe called, maybe driven themselves into panic spiral. Now, they feel the anxiety, recognize it as the pattern, and can choose to do something else. Sit with it, call a friend, go for a walk. The anxiety doesn't go away by choosing differently, but they're not controlled by it anymore. The pattern as old friend trying to protect becomes a helpful frame. Instead of hating the pattern, seeing it as enemy to be destroyed, they can recognize it as part of themselves that developed to keep them safe. When the pattern activates, they can acknowledge it internally. I see you. I know you're trying to protect me. I know you learned that intensity keeps people close, but I'm okay. I can handle this differently now. This compassionate relationship with the pattern is very different from the shame and judgment they used to bring to it. Understanding when pattern emerges helps them prepare. They know now that stress triggers it, that uncertainty triggers it, that new relationships trigger it, that anything that feels threatening to connection will activate the old strategies. This knowledge allows them to be gentle with themselves when it happens instead of being surprised and ashamed. Of course, the pattern emerged. This situation was always going to activate it. That's what patterns do. Learning to pause rather than immediately act on urge is concrete practice. The urge to text, to seek reassurance, to merge, to monitor. These urges come with intensity. The practice is feeling the urge and not acting. Not yet. Maybe not at all. Just waiting. Seeing what happens if they don't immediately relieve the discomfort. Often the urge passes. The anxiety diminishes. They discover they can tolerate more than they thought. The humility of accepting this is lifelong awareness work is important. There's no graduation, no moment where they can say they're done, they've healed completely, the pattern is gone. As long as they're in relationship with others, the pattern will be there, ready to activate under the right conditions. Accepting this prevents the despair that comes from expecting perfection. This is ongoing practice. It will always be ongoing practice. How they can still slip into pattern but recover faster shows progress that's easy to miss. Before, they'd spiral into intensity and stay there for weeks or months before recognizing what happened. Now maybe they slip for a day or two before catching themselves, maybe even just hours. The slip happens, but the recovery is quicker. This is growth, even when it doesn't feel like it. The grief of not being fixed is real. Part of them still wishes for complete transformation, wishes to become someone who doesn't struggle with this, who can enter relationships easily, casually, without the weight of the pattern. Accepting that this is part of who they are, that it will always require awareness and practice, can feel like defeat. But it's actually acceptance of reality, which is the foundation for real peace. The acceptance that healing isn't perfection, allows them to be human. Healing is not becoming someone who never struggles. It's becoming someone who struggles with awareness, with compassion, with tools, with support. It's knowing when to ask for help. It's forgiving themselves when they slip. It's trying again without shame. This kind of healing is sustainable because it doesn't demand the impossible. The pattern is part of them now. Living with the pattern means understanding that some responses are so deeply wired that complete elimination isn't the goal. The goal is conscious relationship with those responses, and in that conscious relationship, something unexpected can emerge. Not the absence of the pattern, but the presence of something that was missing all along. For people who spent years disappearing into others, the most disorienting part of healing is not recognizing the pattern. It is discovering they don't know who they are outside of it. Their preferences feel uncertain. Their desires feel unclear. Their identity feels constructed rather than authentic. The strangeness of having to learn basic self-knowledge is profound. What do I like? Not what does this person like, not what seems attractive or impressive, but what do I actually like? What do I want? What matters to me? These questions, which seem simple, become complex when you've spent decades orienting entirely toward others. The answers aren't readily available because the questions were rarely asked. How they've been a mirror for so long they don't recognize their own face is not metaphor. They've reflected back what others seem to want, what others seem to value, what others seem to need. They became expert at reading others and adjusting accordingly. But their own reflection, their own face, their own self became invisible in the process. Now, trying to see themselves clearly, they find the image unclear, unfamiliar, uncertain. The process of small experiments begins here, choosing without deferring. When asked what restaurant, actually answering instead of saying whatever you want. When asked what movie, stating a preference instead of going along with whatever the other person suggests. These feel like tiny things, but they're revolutionary. Each small choice is a declaration. I exist. I have preferences. My wants matter. The guilt that arises with each act of self-prioritization is immediate and intense. Choosing what they want feels selfish. Stating a preference feels demanding. Saying no feels cruel. The guilt comes because they're violating deeply held beliefs about their role in relationship. Their role was to accommodate, to be flexible, to make things easy. Changing that role feels like betraying who they're supposed to be. Learning that taking up space isn't selfish requires repeated experiences of taking up space and the world not ending. They state a preference. The other person doesn't leave. They say no to something. The relationship survives. They prioritize their own needs. Connection remains. Each experience chips away at the belief that their existence is burden, that their needs are too much, that they must stay small to be loved. Discovering interests that have nothing to do with making them lovable is deeply healing. Finding something they enjoy purely for the joy of it, not because it impresses anyone or makes them more attractive or serves any relationship purpose. Maybe it's painting, maybe it's hiking, maybe it's reading obscure history. Whatever it is, engaging with it purely for themselves, for their own pleasure, for no other reason, reconnects them to self that exists independent of relationship. The loneliness of individuating is real. People who love the accommodating version may resist the change. Partners who benefited from their self-erasure may not like the boundaries. Friends who relied on their emotional support may feel abandoned when they start prioritizing self-care. Some relationships will survive this change, some won't. Learning that this is okay, that growing means some connections fall away, is painful but necessary. Finding their voice after years of silence or agreeability feels awkward and frightening. The first few times they speak up, state an opinion that might be unpopular, disagree with someone they care about, it feels wrong in their body. Like they're being aggressive or difficult or too much. They have to learn that having a voice, using that voice, stating truth as they see it, this isn't aggression, it's existence. The terror and exhilaration of being disliked or disappointing someone comes together. They've spent their lives trying to be likable, trying to please, trying to prevent disappointment. The first time they make a choice they know will disappoint someone, the first time they're willing to be disliked for being honest, it's terrifying. But there's also exhilaration in it. The freedom of not needing everyone's approval, the relief of being real instead of palatable. Learning that they can survive others' displeasure is crucial. Someone is upset with them. Someone is disappointed. Someone expresses frustration. And they don't immediately collapse into fixing, apologizing, adjusting. They allow the other person to have their feelings. They don't take responsibility for managing those feelings. And they discover that they survive it. The displeasure doesn't destroy them. The relationship can hold disagreement. This is profound learning. The slow accumulation of self-trust builds through these experiences. Each time they honor their own knowing instead of deferring to someone else's. Each time they choose themselves and survive it. Each time they trust their own judgment and it works out. The trust builds incrementally. They begin to believe that maybe they can trust themselves. Maybe their own compass is reliable. Maybe they don't need constant external validation to know what's true. Self-reclamation is not about becoming someone new. It is about recovering who was there all along, underneath the performance, underneath the pattern, underneath the fear. As self returns, so does a different kind of longing. Not the desperate need for merger, but a genuine desire for connection. There is a kind of love that people who love too hard, too fast have rarely experienced. It is quieter than what they're used to, steadier, less urgent. At first it can feel wrong, it can feel boring, it can feel like it's not enough. Learning to recognize healthy love when nervous system is calibrated to intensity is challenging. They meet someone who is consistent, available, clear in their communication, respectful of boundaries, and it feels flat. There's no obsessive thinking, no desperate need to be together constantly, no anxiety about where they stand. The absence of intensity registers not as peace but as lack of chemistry. They wonder if they're really attracted to this person. They question if this could be real love when it feels so different from what they're used to. The paradox that secure feels unsafe because it's unfamiliar is precisely what they're experiencing. The nervous system learned that love comes with activation, with uncertainty, with intensity. Calm, steady presence doesn't trigger the same neurochemical response, so the body interprets it as absence rather than safety. They have to learn consciously what their nervous system doesn't know instinctively. That calm is not the same as indifferent, that steady is not the same as boring, that secure is not the same as passionless. How they have to learn to tolerate steadiness, reliability, lack of drama, requires active choice. When there's no crisis to manage, no anxiety to navigate, no uncertainty to obsess over, they feel strangely empty. They're so used to activation that regulation feels like numbness. They have to practice being present with calm, have to learn that the absence of chaos doesn't mean absence of connection, have to teach their nervous system that steady is actually what safety feels like. Differentiated love means two whole people choosing connection, not merger. Each person maintains their own identity, their own friendships, their own interests. They come together and create something shared, but they don't dissolve into each other. This is foreign territory for people who learned that love means becoming one. Learning that they can be deeply connected while remaining separate. That interdependence is different from enmeshment. That they can need someone without needing to merge with them completely. Learning that space in relationship isn't abandonment happens through repeated experience. The first time their partner needs an evening alone and they don't panic. The first time they spend a weekend apart and connection remains intact when they reunite. The first time one of them is busy with work and the other doesn't interpret it as rejection. Each experience teaches the nervous system that space is part of a healthy relationship, not a threat to it. Discovering that conflict can strengthen rather than destroy changes everything. They have disagreement, they express different needs, they don't agree on something important, and instead of the relationship ending, they work through it. They learn more about each other. They negotiate, they find compromise or agree to disagree. The relationship becomes deeper because of the conflict, not despite it. This is revolutionary for someone who learned that conflict equals abandonment. How they can express needs without fear of losing person requires building trust over time. The first few times they express need, they're braced for rejection. But the person responds with care. They ask what's needed. They try to meet the need when possible. They don't punish the vulnerability. Slowly, painfully slowly, the person learns that maybe needs aren't burdensome. Maybe needs are part of a relationship. Maybe expressing needs brings people closer rather than pushing them away. The relief and strangeness of not having to monitor constantly is disorienting at first. What do they do with all the energy they use to spend analysing texts, tracking moods, interpreting signals? Without the constant vigilance, they feel almost unmoored. But gradually, the relief becomes larger than the strangeness. The peace of trusting instead of monitoring. The ease of being present instead of calculating. The freedom of not being controlled by anxiety about the relationship. Learning that they can be imperfect and still chosen is the healing they've needed their whole life. They make mistakes. They're not always their best self. They have bad days, difficult moments, times when they're unavailable or struggling, and the person stays, not because they're perfect, not because they're performing flawlessly, not because they're being indispensable. The person stays because they choose to. This experience, repeated over time, begins to heal the core wound that they must be perfect to be worthy. The vulnerability of accepting love they didn't have to earn feels exposing and terrifying. They're so used to the transaction model, used to proving worth through service, used to earning love through performance. When someone offers love freely, with no strings attached, no debt incurred, no performance required, they don't know how to receive it. It feels too vulnerable. Like if they accept it without earning it, it could be taken away at any moment. Learning to receive freely given love is its own kind of courage. How this kind of love requires tolerating uncertainty in a different way is important to understand. Intensity provides illusion of certainty through constant contact and monitoring. Healthy love requires tolerating not knowing every detail, not tracking every mood, not being together constantly. It requires trusting that the relationship continues to exist even when they're not actively managing it. This uncertainty is different from the uncertainty they're used to, but it's still uncertainty, and they have to learn to tolerate it. This is what they've needed all along. Yet even in healthy love, even with awareness and practice, the old pattern will still whisper, still pull, still tempt with its familiar intensity. Healing from the pattern of loving too hard, too fast is not a destination. It is a practice. There is no moment of arrival, no final transformation, no permanent cure. There are only repeated choices made conscious, made again and again. The pattern will re-emerge under specific conditions. Job loss can trigger it. Relationship uncertainty can trigger it. Major life transitions can trigger it. Trauma can trigger it. Illness can trigger it. Anything that destabilizes them or threatens their sense of security can reactivate the old strategies. They might be doing well for months or years, and then life becomes stressful, and suddenly they're monitoring texts again, seeking excessive reassurance, feeling the familiar urgency. How they'll still have moments of wanting to merge, monitor, perform is ongoing reality. The urges don't permanently disappear. They become less frequent, less intense, less controlling. But they're still there. Meeting someone new might still trigger the desire to see them constantly. Conflict might still trigger the urge to immediately fix everything. Uncertainty might still trigger the need to know exactly where they stand. The urges arise. The work is in how they respond. The difference now is they notice faster, recover quicker, forgive themselves more readily. Before, they might spiral for weeks before recognizing what was happening. Now maybe they notice within days, maybe within hours, maybe even in the moment. The noticing gets quicker, and once they notice, they can use their tools, reach out for support, make different choices. The recovery from slipping into pattern becomes faster because they have practice with recovery now. Learning that relapse into pattern isn't failure, its information shifts everything. When they fall back into old patterns and respond with shame and self-criticism, they make everything worse. The pattern plus the shame creates another layer of suffering. When they can see the pattern re-emerge and respond with curiosity and compassion, they can learn from it. What triggered this? What was I needing? What does this tell me about where I am right now? The pattern becomes information instead of evidence of failure. The lifelong nature of working with attachment wounds is humbling but also relieving. There's no pressure to be fixed by a certain age or after a certain amount of therapy. This is lifelong work because relationship is lifelong. As long as they're connecting with others, the old patterns will have opportunity to emerge. Accepting this removes the pressure of perfection and allows for ongoing practice. How progress isn't linear becomes very clear over time. There will be periods where things feel easy, where they're managing well, where the pattern seems distant. Then there will be periods of regression, where they feel like they're back at the beginning. This isn't actually regression to the beginning. They've built skills, awareness, new pathways. But it can feel that way when stress reactivates old patterns. Understanding that healing moves in spirals, not straight lines, helps them be patient with the process. The importance of self-compassion when pattern activates cannot be overstated. The pattern emerged, Of course it did. They're under stress, or they met someone new, or something triggered the old wound. Instead of berating themselves, they can offer understanding. This makes sense. This pattern developed to protect me. It's trying to help even though it's not helpful anymore. I can acknowledge it and choose differently. This compassionate response creates safety that allows the nervous system to settle. Understanding their specific vulnerabilities and triggers helps them prepare. They know now what situations are likely to activate the pattern. New relationships, job stress, conflict, feeling criticized, sensing distance in important relationships. Knowing this allows them to increase support during these times, to be extra gentle with themselves, to reach out to therapists or trusted friends, to not be surprised when the pattern emerges in predictable circumstances. The practice of returning to awareness after going unconscious strengthens with repetition. They will go unconscious to the pattern, will fall fully back into old strategies. But each time they return to awareness, each time they catch themselves and reorient, they're strengthening the pathway of conscious relationship with the pattern. The returning becomes as important as not leaving in the first place. How each return strengthens the new pathway is literal neuroscience. The pathway of awareness, of noticing, of choosing differently. Each time they use this pathway, it becomes more established. Eventually, the return to awareness can happen more quickly, more easily, because the pathway has been traveled so many times. This is why practice matters more than perfection. The acceptance that this is part of who they are brings unexpected peace. Fighting the pattern, trying to destroy it, hating it. This created war within themselves, accepting it as part of them, as something to work with rather than against, as old protection that developed for good reason. This acceptance allows them to relate to themselves with more wholeness. The pattern is an enemy, it's part of them that needs compassion and gentle guidance. This is lifelong work. The pattern of loving too hard too fast becomes something they live with rather than something that lives them. The difference is everything, and in that difference, in that small shift from unconscious pattern to conscious relationship, something profound becomes possible. There is something that rarely gets acknowledged about people who love too hard too fast. The same sensitivity that created their wound also gave them extraordinary capacities. The ability to read others deeply, to feel intensely, to commit completely, to care profoundly. The deep empathy that comes from childhood hypervigilance is real capacity. They learned to read emotional states because survival depended on it. This made them deeply attuned to others. They can sense when something is wrong before it's spoken. They can feel shifts in energy in a room. They can understand what people need often before those people know themselves. This capacity, when not driven by anxiety, is profound gift. The capacity for profound connection when not driven by fear is remarkable. They know how to go deep. They know how to be vulnerable. They know how to show up with full presence. When this capacity isn't being used to prevent abandonment, when it's offered freely from secure place, it creates the kind of intimacy most people long for. Their ability to connect deeply is not the problem. The fear driving it was the problem. The loyalty and devotion that, when boundaried, is remarkable. They know how to commit. They know how to stay. They know how to show up consistently for people they care about. When this loyalty comes from choice rather than fear, when it's boundaried rather than enmeshed, it's incredible strength. The people in their life who receive this loyalty are fortunate. The emotional intelligence developed through constant monitoring serves them well. They understand relationship dynamics. They recognize patterns. They can navigate complexity. They've spent their life studying human emotion and interaction. This knowledge, when used consciously rather than reactively, makes them wise about relationships. They can offer insight to others. They can help people understand their own patterns. How the intensity, when channeled, creates passion for causes, art, work. The intensity doesn't have to be only about romantic relationships. When directed toward purpose, toward creative expression, toward causes they believe in, the same intensity that overwhelmed partners can fuel extraordinary work. They can focus deeply. They can commit fully. They can pour themselves into what matters. The courage it took to keep loving despite repeated hurt should not be overlooked. Most people, after experiencing what they've experienced, would close off completely, would decide that love isn't worth the risk. But they kept trying, kept opening, kept hoping. That took tremendous courage. The fact that the pattern didn't serve them well doesn't diminish the bravery of continuing to reach for connection despite pain. The resilience of continuing to hope despite disappointment shows strength. Each relationship that ended could have been the one that made them give up, but they didn't give up. They kept believing that connection was possible. They kept working on themselves. They kept trying to do better. This resilience, when recognized and honored, is a powerful resource. How these capacities were survival mechanisms but can become conscious choices changes their relationship to their own traits. The empathy was survival skill. The intensity was protection. The monitoring was necessary awareness. These developed for good reason. They served purpose. Now they can choose when to use these capacities, can direct them consciously, can offer them when appropriate rather than having them activated automatically. The difference between unconscious pattern and conscious use of capacity is everything. Unconscious empathy means absorbing everyone's emotions without boundaries. Conscious empathy means being aware of others' feelings while maintaining own center. Unconscious intensity means overwhelming people. Conscious intensity means bringing full passion to what matters. The capacities remain. The consciousness of how to use them is what shifts. Learning to direct these gifts towards self, toward worthy relationships, toward purpose fulfills what the pattern was seeking all along. They have enormous capacity to care. When that care is directed toward themselves first, then toward relationships that can hold it, then toward work or causes that benefit from it, the capacity becomes gift rather than wound. They don't have to diminish themselves. They have to redirect themselves. The pattern made them who they are. The pattern of loving too hard too fast is not something to eradicate. It is something to understand, to work with, to transform from unconscious reaction into conscious capacity. This understanding changes the entire journey. It's no longer about fixing what's broken. It's about integrating what was fractured. Wholeness does not mean the absence of the pattern. Wholeness means having room for all of it. The child who learned love was dangerous. The adult who keeps choosing it anyway. The wound that still aches. The healing that slowly accumulates. The desperate part and the growing part and the wise part all existing together. Integration rather than elimination, as the goal shifts everything. They're not trying to become someone who never struggles with anxious attachment. They're learning to hold all the parts. The part that panics when someone pulls away. The the part that knows rationally this panic isn't about present reality, the part that can offer compassion to the panicking part, the part that can choose differently despite the panic. All these parts are them. Integration means making room for all of them. Holding compassion for the child who developed the pattern is essential. That child was doing their absolute best in difficult circumstances. They were trying to be loved, trying to be safe, trying to matter. The strategies they developed made sense. They were intelligent adaptations. Blaming that child or hating those strategies only creates more fracture. Compassion for young self who did what they needed to survive allows healing. Accepting the adult who still struggles with it brings that same compassion forward. They're not broken for struggling. They're not weak for having this pattern. They're human, carrying old wounds, doing their best to heal while living full life. The adult who slips back into pattern, who has hard days, who struggles with relationships. This adult deserves compassion, not criticism. Understanding past doesn't excuse present, but explains it releases both shame and bypass. They're not off the hook for their behaviour just because they had difficult childhood. They're still responsible for their choices, their impact on others, their work to do better. And simultaneously, understanding where the pattern came from helps them not hate themselves for having it. Explanation without excuse. Responsibility without shame. Learning to parent themselves in ways they weren't parented is profound healing. The child didn't receive consistent love, didn't receive reassurance about their worth, didn't receive safety to be imperfect. The adult can offer this to themselves now, can reassure the scared parts, can validate the confused parts, can comfort the hurting parts. They become for themselves what they needed then. The complexity of simultaneously healing and being wounded is reality. They're not healed and then done. They're always both. Always carrying wounds that haven't fully healed while also doing the work of healing. Always capable of being triggered while also capable of responding differently. The both and nature of healing means they're never just one thing. Never just wounded, never just healed, always both. How they can be both in recovery and still affected by. Original injury challenges linear thinking about healing. Recovery isn't destination where injury no longer affects them. Recovery is ongoing process of working with injury, of building resources to manage it, of creating life where injury doesn't control them even though it's still present. They're recovering and affected. Both true. The non-binary nature of healing means releasing healed versus broken categories. They're not broken waiting to be fixed. They're not healed and finished with this work. They're complex humans carrying old wounds and building new capacities and navigating relationships and doing their best. The binary categories don't fit human reality. Letting go of them allows more peace. Making peace with imperfection, with ongoing work, with being human releases impossible standards. They don't have to have this figured out completely. Don't have to never struggle. Don't have to be perfect at relationships. They're allowed to be messy, uncertain, still learning. The peace that comes with accepting human limitations is deeper than the peace that would come from achieving impossible perfection. The wholeness that comes from acceptance rather than perfection is real wholeness, not the wholeness of having no broken parts, the wholeness of accepting all parts, broken and healing and strong and weak, making room for the full complexity of being human. This wholeness is accessible because it doesn't require fixing everything, just accepting everything. How they become more themselves by accepting all parts is the paradox of integration. By trying to cut off the parts they didn't like, they became fragmented. By accepting all parts, including the ones they wished weren't there, they become whole, more fully themselves. The self that includes the pattern, includes the wound, includes the healing, includes all of it. This self is more real than the curated self they used to present. Integration doesn't resolve the paradox of being human, wounded and healing, broken and whole, patterned and free. It simply makes room for all of it to be true at once. And in that spaciousness, in that capacity to hold contradiction, a different relationship to themselves becomes possible. The pattern of loving too hard, too fast is often accompanied by brutal self-judgment. Every time the pattern activates, every time they fall back into old responses, the inner critic attacks. Weak, broken, too much, not enough. The criticism is relentless. How self-judgment keeps the pattern alive by creating shame is important to understand. When they slip into the pattern and respond with harsh criticism, they're adding another layer of dysregulation. The pattern activated their nervous system. The self-judgment activates it further. Now they're dealing with the original anxiety plus the shame about having the anxiety. The shame makes them feel worse, which makes them more likely to seek regulation through the pattern. Self-judgment perpetuates the cycle. The necessity of self-compassion for any real change cannot be overstated. When they can notice the pattern activating and respond with kindness, the nervous system has space to settle. Oh, this is the pattern. This makes sense given my history. I'm having a hard time right now. What do I need? This compassionate response doesn't fuel the pattern. It creates the safety needed to choose differently. Learning to speak to themselves the way they'd speak to a child requires conscious practice. They would never tell a scared child they're weak or broken. They would offer reassurance, understanding, comfort. They can learn to offer this to their own scared parts. When anxiety arises, instead of criticizing it, they can acknowledge it. I know you're scared. I know this feels threatening. I'm here with you. We're okay. Understanding that the pattern was adaptive, not pathological, shifts self-judgment towards self-compassion. The pattern wasn't character flaw. It was intelligent response to difficult circumstances. Their nervous system did exactly what it needed to do to survive. Recognizing this changes everything. The part of them that loves too hard, too fast was trying to protect them. It deserves gratitude, not contempt. How shame makes them hide rather than heal perpetuates isolation. When they're drowning in shame about their patterns, they don't reach out for help. Don't talk about what they're struggling with. Don't ask for support. The shame isolates them, which makes the pattern stronger because isolation is what the pattern is trying to prevent. Self-compassion allows them to reach out, to be seen in their struggle, to receive support. The revolutionary act of treating themselves with kindness after a lifetime of self-criticism feels wrong at first. Every instinct says they should be harder on themselves, should push themselves more, should demand better. Learning that kindness is actually what creates change, that compassion is what allows growth, challenges everything they learned about how to improve themselves. Learning that self-compassion isn't self-indulgence matters. They fear that being kind to themselves means excusing bad behavior, means not pushing for growth, means settling for less. But self-compassion is what makes growth sustainable. Harsh criticism creates resistance and shame. Compassion creates safety and openness. they can be kind to themselves and still work toward change. The two aren't opposites. How they must extend to themselves what they freely give others is obvious once stated, but difficult in practice. They can offer endless compassion to friends who struggle, can hold space for others' imperfections, can love others through their worst moments. Learning to offer the same to themselves, to be for themselves the kind of friend they are to others, is the practice. The difficulty of self-compassion when it was never modelled explains why this is hard. If they grew up with criticism, with conditional love, with harsh judgment for mistakes, self-compassion feels foreign. There's no template for it. They have to learn it from scratch, often in therapy or through books or through conscious practice. It doesn't come naturally when it wasn't taught. Practicing self-kindness, especially when pattern activates, is when it matters most. When things are going well, self-compassion is easier. When they've slipped back into old patterns, when they're struggling, when they feel like they're failing. That's when they need compassion most. That's when the harsh critic usually shows up. Learning to bring kindness precisely in those moments is the transformative practice. How self-compassion creates safety nervous system needs to change brings this full circle. The nervous system needs safety to release old patterns. Harsh self-judgment creates threat. Compassionate self-response creates safety. When they can be kind to themselves, when they can hold their struggles with gentleness, the nervous system can begin to settle, can begin to trust that change is possible. Self-compassion isn't soft weakness. It's the foundation everything else builds on. Self-compassion is not the reward for healing. It is the condition that makes healing possible. Without it, all other work is built on unstable ground. With self-compassion as foundation, the final truth can be acknowledged. The truth that changes everything. The deepest truth beneath the pattern of loving too hard, too fast is this. It was never about being unlovable. It was never about being too much or not enough. It was about learning, very early, that love was something to chase rather than something to rest in. The core wound is the belief they are fundamentally unworthy of steady love, that they have to earn it, that they have to prove it, that they have to work for it constantly. This belief drives the pattern, the intensity, the merger, the monitoring, the performance. All of it designed to secure what they believe they're not entitled to simply by existing. How the pattern was proof of this belief, not the cause, shifts perspective. They didn't develop the pattern and then come to believe they were unworthy. They believed they were unworthy and developed the pattern as a response. The pattern was an attempt to manage the wound, not the wound itself. Understanding this means working with the belief, not just the behaviour. Understanding that they've been searching outside for what could only be found inside is the crucial insight. They were looking for someone else to tell them they were worthy, someone else to prove they were enough, someone else to make them feel complete. But worthiness can only come from within. No amount of external validation could ever fill the internal void. The search was always going to fail because they were looking in the wrong place. The child inside, still waiting to be loved as they were, not for what they do, needs attention. There's a part of them, frozen at whatever age the wound formed, still waiting, still hoping someone will come and love them unconditionally. We'll see them fully and choose them anyway. We'll prove that they don't have to perform to be worthy. This part needs to hear that the waiting is over, that the adult they've become can offer what the child needed. How healing is learning to offer themselves what was missing brings responsibility and freedom together. They can't go back and change childhood, can't make their parents different, can't undo the wound. But they can offer themselves now what they didn't receive then, can learn to validate their own emotions, can learn to reassure their own fears, can learn to love themselves steadily. This is both responsibility and liberation. The truth that they are enough without the performance, without the intensity, without the sacrifice, needs to be felt, not just understood. Intellectually, they might know this, but knowing in the mind and believing in the body are different. The work is letting this truth land, letting themselves feel their own enoughness, letting themselves rest in being rather than constantly doing. How the pattern protected them but also kept them from themselves explains why it's both grateful for and ready to release. The pattern served them. It helped them survive. It created some connection, even if that connection was anxious and unsustainable. But it also kept them from themselves, kept them from being seen, kept them from real intimacy. They can be grateful for how it served them, while also choosing to move beyond it. Learning to be the secure base they never had is reparenting work. The secure base is the person you can always return to, the one who's consistently there, the one who doesn't punish you for having needs, the one who loves you through your worst. They didn't have this, but they can become this for themselves, can be the constant, reliable, unconditionally loving presence they needed. The ongoing process of returning to self after each departure becomes the practice. They will still leave themselves, will still abandon their needs, will still disappear into performance, but they can practice returning, noticing when they've left, coming back, again and again. The returning becomes more familiar than the leaving, and in that pattern of returning, they find home. How this is not the end but a beginning opens toward future. This isn't conclusion where everything resolves. This is the point where real work begins, where they understand enough to make different choices, where they have enough tools to do it differently, where they have enough self-compassion to keep trying. The beginning of living differently, the beginning of loving differently, starting with themselves. The opening into possibility when the pattern loosens its grip shows what's ahead. When they're not controlled by the pattern, what becomes possible? Authentic relationships, creative expression, peace in solitude, confidence in themselves, connection without loss of self. All of this waits on the other side of the pattern's dominance, not perfection, not absence of struggle, just possibility. The invitation to love differently, starting with self, is where transformation begins. Different love doesn't start with finding different partner. It starts with relating to themselves differently, with offering themselves the steadiness they seek, with becoming to themselves what they've been searching for in others. This is the foundation. Everything else builds from here. The pattern of loving too hard too fast doesn't define them. It never did. It was simply the best strategy a young nervous system could develop with the information it had. And now, with new information, with lived experience of something different, with growing capacity for self-compassion and secure connection, a different strategy becomes possible. Not perfect, not permanent, not free of stumbling, but possible. And possibility, after years of feeling trapped in pattern, is everything. This is where transformation begins, not in dramatic change, but in small persistent returns to truth. The truth that they are worthy of the same love they give so freely to others. The truth that connection can survive separateness. The truth that love does not require disappearing. These truths must be learned slowly, in the body, through experience. Understanding alone cannot dissolve what was wired through years of survival, but understanding opens the door, and beyond that door is not perfection or arrival, but something more valuable, the ongoing practice of coming home to themselves, again and again, after each departure, after each moment of falling into old pattern. The return becomes more familiar than the leaving, and in that returning, they discover they were never actually lost. They were just looking for themselves in someone else's eyes, when all along they were right here, waiting to be found, waiting to be welcomed, waiting to be loved by the one person who could never abandon them, themselves.